That such weak half-units were detained in the peninsula was due to a resolve of Wellington's, made after the campaign of 1811. During the latter part of that year, the chief of his worries was that he had been sent out among his reinforcements a number of corps which had served in the Walcheren expedition, where almost every man had the seeds of ague in him, from a sojourn in the marshes of Holland. The heat of the Portuguese summer and the torrential rains of the autumn at once brought out the latent weakness in the constitution of men who were little more than convalescents, and regiments which had landed at Lisbon in July 850 strong showed only 550 in the ranks in October. 181 so appalling was the accumulation of fever and ague cases in the hospitals 182 that Wellington wrote home to beg that not another unit which had been at Walcheren might be sent out to him. He now made up his mind to keep old regiments, even when they had dwindled rather low in numbers, rather than to send them home to recruit and to receive new battalions in their stead. The reason was that it took a corps many months before it learnt to shift for itself and to grow acclimatized. During their first few months in the peninsula, newly arrived units always showed too many sick and too many stragglers, for men fresh from barrack life in England were at first prostrated by the heat of the climate and the length of the marches. They had still to pick up the old campaigners' tricks and were very helpless. Veteran troops were so superior in endurance to new regiments from England, most of whom had been on the pestilential Walcheren expedition, and were still full of rickety convalescence, 188, that Wellington determined to keep even remnants of old corps accustomed to the air of the peninsula, rather than to ask for more unacclimatized battalions from home. Hence came the institution, in the end of 1812, of two of the provisional battalions already mentioned. 183, at an earlier period of the war, they would undoubtedly have been sent back to England. 184, but now these fractions of depleted veteran corps were taken, with excellent results, all through the campaign of 1812-13-14. Fate of second battalions. It is perhaps worthwhile to make a note how curious was Wellington's attitude in face of that rather exceptional occurrence, the appearance of two strong battalions of the same regiment in his army. If the second battalion was weak, he soon drafted it into the first and sent it home. But when, from some chance, both had full ranks, it did not by any means always strike him as necessary to brigade them together. For example, the 1/7th and 7th were both at the front from October 1810 to July 1811, but for several months of the time one was in the 4th Division, the other in the 1st. A still more striking instance is that of the 48th. Its two battalions were both from their first arrival placed in the 2nd Division, but they served from June 1809 to May 1811 in different brigades of it. 185. The occasions when the two battalions of the same regiment served for any 189 time in one brigade were very rare. I only know of the cases of the 1st Anad battalions of the Foot Guards in 1813-14, of the two battalions of the 52nd between March 1811 and March 1812, and of those of the 7th Fusiliers, who after some service apart had been brigaded together in the 4th Division 6 months before Albuera. In the last two cases, the 1st Battalion presently absorbed the 2nd, which was sent home as a skeleton cadre when its strength at last began to run low. All other cases of juxtaposition were so short that it would seem that Wellington only brought the two battalions together for the purpose of drafting the 2nd into the 1st at the earliest convenient moment. In this way, the 288th, long in garrison at Lisbon, were brought up to the front to be amalgamated in less than 4 months with the 188th, March-July 1811. The 1/5th, coming out in the summer of 1812, seems to have served along with the 2/5 for about the same number of months, the latter being sent home in October. The 138th similarly arrived at about the same time and served from June to November beside the 238th, which then departed. These are very different cases from those of the two battalions of the 7th, the 48th, and the 52nd, all of which were present for a year or more together in the army. Plate V. Officer of Rifles. 1809. Private Infantry of the Line. The theoretical establishment of about 1150 of all ranks for a 1st Battalion was, of course, hardly ever seen in the field. Regiments which landed at Lisbon with a full complement soon dwindled, even before they got to the front, and nothing was rarer than a battalion in line of battle with a total strength in the four figures. 186, a good well-managed corps which had not been in action of late and had not been stationed in an unhealthy cantonment, might keep up to 700 and even 800 men throughout a campaign. The Guards battalions, which had a decidedly larger establishment than those of the line, were frequently up to 900 men or more. On the other hand, a battalion which had seen much fighting, which had not received its drafts regularly, and had long starved on the bleak mountains of Beira or sweltered in the pestilential valley of the Guadiana, often worked down to 450 men or less, even if it were a 1st Battalion which had landed with its foo rank and file. 2nd Battalion, under similar circumstances, might shrink to 250 or 300. At the end of the very fatiguing campaign of 1811, which had included the toilsome pursuit of Massena, the Fuentes d'Oñoro fighting, and the long tarrying on the Caya during the unhealthy summer heats, of 46 battalions present with Wellington's main army, only 9, all save 1 1st Battalions, and 2 of them belonging to the Guards, showed more than 700 of all ranks present. 16 more had between 500 and 10 between 400, and no less than 11 were down to the miserable figure of under 400 men. And it is to be noted that of these nearly all were either 2nd Battalions, 191, or single battalion regiments. There were 6 of the former, 3 of the latter among them. The average of the whole, it may be seen, was about 550 men per unit. The extreme variation was between 1,005 for the strongest battalion and for the weakest. 187, at this time, it should be noted, the army was more sickly than it had ever been before, having over 14,000 men in hospital to 29,300 present with the colors. Wellington was never again so encumbered with sick, save for one period of a few weeks, that which followed the end of the retreat from Burgos to Ciudad Rodrigo in October-November 1813. During the first months of this winter, the troops, tired by incessant marching in the rain and low feeding, sent into hospital a number of cases not less distressing than those which had been seen in September 1811. But a short period of rest served to re-establish their health, and in 1813-14 the troops were very healthy, even during the trying weeks when many of them were cantoned high among the snows of the Pyrenean passes. The cavalry regiments. So much for the infantry regiments. A few words as regards the cavalry must be added to this chapter on organization. From first to last, Wellington had under him 21 regiments of British horse, besides 4 more of the light and heavy cavalry of the King's German Legion. But at no time had he such a force as would be represented by this total. He started in 1809 with 8 regiments. Before he had been many weeks in command, one of his units, a fractional one, composed of 2 squadrons of the 20th Light Dragoons, was taken from him and shipped off to Sicily. Before the end of the year, another 23rd Light Dragoons, which had been badly cut up at Talavera and lost half its strength there, was sent home to recruit. Thus he had only 6 regiments, 188 on 192 January 1, 1810, and as only one joined him that year, 189.7 was his total force, till he at last received large reinforcements in the late summer and autumn of 1811. But he started the campaign of 1812 with 16 regiments, 190, which was almost the highest figure that he was to own. For although during the campaign of 1813 he was sent 4 new hussar regiments, yet at the same time 4 depleted corps were sent home to be recruited and reorganized. This would have left his total at the same figure of 16 units as in 1812, if he had not also received a large composite regiment, or weak brigade, composed of 2 squadrons from each of the 3 units of the household. Cavalry. By this addition alone did his cavalry force in 1813-14 exceed that which he had possessed in 1812. If we reckon the household squadrons as roughly equivalent to 2 units, the total at the end of the war was 18 regiments. Faults of raw cavalry. Unlike the infantry, the cavalry of the British Army was organized without exception in isolated units, as it is today. A corps sent to the peninsula left a depart squadron behind it, and there was no source except this depart from which it could draw recruits. Nothing resembling the sister unit on which an infantry battalion depended was in existence. Hence, if a cavalry regiment sank low in numbers and exhausted the drafts which the depart squadron could send out, it had to return to England to recruit. During the whole war, only one corps, the 23rd Light Dragoons at Talavera, suffered a complete disaster, corresponding to that which the 2nd Infantry Division incurred at Albura, and this unlucky regiment was sent home that autumn, when the British Army had retreated to the Portuguese frontier. But 4 others worked down so low in strength, and especially in horses, during the campaign of 1812, that, although 193, they had none of them been thinned down in a single action like the 23rd, they had become ineffective and had to quit the peninsula. It is most noteworthy that all of these 4 corps were comparatively recent arrivals. They had come out in 1811, and in little over a single year had fallen into a state of inefficiency far exceeding that of the regiments whose service dated back to 1809, and who had seen 2 years more of hard campaigning. 191. The moral to be drawn is the same that we have noted with the infantry. The regiments which had served Wellington since his first arrival had become acclimatized and had learnt the tricks of the old soldier. They could shift for themselves, and what was no less important, for their horses, far better than any newly arrived corps. We find bitter complaints of the defective scouting and outpost work of the newcomers. After a petty disaster to the outlying pickets of 2 of the lately landed regiments, Wellington wrote, "This disagreeable circumstance tends to show the difference between old and new troops. The old regiments of cavalry throughout all their service, with all their losses put together, have not lost so many men as the 2nd Hussars of the Legion and the 11th Light Dragoons in a few days. However, we must try to make the new as good as the old." 192. This was evidently not too easy to accomplish. At any rate, at the end of the next year, it was 4 of the new Corps 193 which were sent home as depleted units, not any of the 7 old ones. All these, without exception, endured to the last campaign of 1814, though they nearly all 194 had to be reduced from a 4-squadron 194 to a 3-squadron establishment in the autumn of 1811, owing to their shrunken effective. But they never fell so low as the 4 corps condemned to return to England in the next year. No more regiments went home after the winter of 1812-13. The campaign of Vittoria and the Pyrenees did not bear heavily on the cavalry, most of whom, during the mountain fighting in the autumn, were comfortably cantoned in the Ebro Valley. They only moved forward again in the spring of 1814 for that invasion of France, which was brought to such an abrupt end by the fall of Napoleon. The theoretical establishment of the regiments of cavalry, putting aside the household cavalry, was in 1809 fixed at 905 men in nearly every case. But a large depart was always left behind in England, and if a regiment lands sabres in Portugal in 4 squadrons, it was up to the average strength. At the front it would seldom show more than 450, as horses began to die off or go sick the moment that they felt the peninsular air and diet. A regiment which had been reduced from 4 squadrons to 3 might show only 300 men on parade in the middle of a campaign. Plate VI. Officer of Light Dragoons. Uniform of 1809. Officer of Light Dragoons. Uniform of 1813. Chapter 11. Internal organization of the regiment, the officers. Hitherto we have been dealing with the regiment considered as a whole, and mainly with its place in the brigade and division to which it had been allotted. We must now pass on to consider it not as a whole, but as an assemblage of parts, officers, staff, sergeants, rank and file, and musicians. To understand the mechanism of a regiment, it is first necessary to say something about the establishment of officers. Battalions and cavalry regiments were normally commanded by a lieutenant colonel. There were very few full colonels with the army, and almost the only ones who commanded a unit were those of the brigades of guards, where owing to the double rank, which made all lieutenants captains in the army, all captains lieutenant colonels, and all majors and lieutenant colonels full colonels, it resulted that the battalion commander always held a colonelcy. Devolution of command. When the lieutenant colonel in a battalion was dead, wounded, or sick, the unit was often commanded by the senior major. There were normally two of them, sometimes for many months at a time, till the absent officer returned or his place was filled by promotion. Cases were known where, owing to great mortality or invaliding in the senior ranks, a captain might be found in command of the battalion for a certain space. I note that about the time of Basacco, the morning state of the army shows two units, both of the guards, commanded by colonels, 30 by lieutenant colonels, 16 by majors, 1 by a captain, and this, I think, was a fairly normal proportion. 196. In addition to the colonel and the two majors, an infantry battalion at full strength would possess 10 captains and 20 subalterns, or a trifle more, giving the allowance of 3 officers per company, with a few over. How many of the subalterns would be lieutenants, and how many ensigns, calend lieutenants in the rifle regiments, was a matter of mere chance, but the lieutenants were nearly always in a majority. 195. A glance down the morning state of the Basacco Army of September 1811 shows that one battalion, 145th, had no more than 1 ensign, another, the 74th, as many as 11. It was very rare for a regiment to have its full establishment of 10 captains present. There were nearly always 1 or 2 companies commanded by their senior lieutenants. In addition to its company officers, every battalion had its staff, composed of the adjutant, paymaster, quartermaster, and the surgeon, with his 2 assistant surgeons. The adjutant was usually a lieutenant, but occasionally an ensign. In the guards, where most ranks counted a step higher than in the line, he was usually a lieutenant and captain. In addition to the officers regularly commissioned, a battalion had often with it 1 or 2 volunteers, young men who were practically probationers. They were allowed to come out to an active service battalion on the chance of being gazetted to it without purchase, on their own responsibility. They carried muskets and served in the ranks, but were allowed to wear uniforms of a better cloth than that given to the rank and file, and messed with the officers. The most astonishing case of devolution of acting rank through the death or wounding of many seniors was at the Battle of Albura. On the morning after that action, the wrecks of the 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Division, temporarily united into one battalion because of the dreadful losses which had fallen on every one of the 3 units, of which 197 it consisted, were commanded by the senior captain of the 148th Regiment, and he, as it chanced, was a French émigré with the somewhat lugubrious name of Cimetière. The brigade had been reduced, it may be remarked, from a strength of 1651 to 597 in the battle, no less than 1054 officers and men being killed, wounded, or missing, and the brigadier, with 5 lieutenant colonels and majors senior to Cimetière having been killed or wounded. 196, but the Albura losses were, of course, the record in the way of heavy casualties. There is nothing that can be compared to them in the annals of Wellington's army for general slaughter extending all through an army, though certain individual regiments in particular engagements suffered almost as heavily, e.g. in the storm of Badajoz and at Waterloo. The chances of temporary command were sometimes curious. The gallant Colborne, whom I have already had occasion to mention, though only a lieutenant colonel, commanded a brigade at Albura, owing to the absence of the brigadier, he being the senior of 4 battalion commanders. He then commanded his own regiment only during 1811-13, but succeeded as senior lieutenant colonel to the charge of a brigade of the light division for the last 6 months of the war. Though he had thus twice commanded a brigade with distinction in the peninsula, we find him in the Waterloo campaign once more at the head of his own 52nd Foot, in Adams' brigade. It is true that with his single battalion he there did more than most of the generals, by giving the decisive stroke which wrecked the attack of the French Guard. Not only did lieutenant colonels practically become brigadiers, in an interim fashion pretty frequently, but once at least an officer with no higher rank commanded a whole division for some months. This was Colonel Andrew Barnard, who after Crawford fell at Ciudad Rodrigo, and 198 the only other general with the division, Vandeleur, was wounded, had charge of the most precious unit of Wellington's whole army for nearly 5 months, and headed it at the storm of Badajoz. There seems to have been a similar, but a shorter phenomenon of this sort with the 3rd Division, after the fall of Badajoz, when Generals Picton and Kempt being both disabled. Colonel Wallace of the Connaught Rangers commanded the division for a week or two till Wellington drafted in his brother-in-law, General Pakenham, to lead it, which he did with great distinction at Salamanca. 197. The purchase system. Promotion in the British Army at this period was working in the most irregular and spasmodic fashion, there being two separate influences operating in diametrically opposite ways. The one was the purchase system, the other the frequent, but not by any means sufficiently frequent, promotion for merit and good service in the field. The practice at the Horse Guards was that casualties by deaths in action were filled up inside the regiment without money passing, but that for all other vacancies the purchase system worked. When a lieutenant colonelcy, majority, or captaincy was vacant, the senior in the next lower rank had a moral right to be offered the vacancy at the regulation price. But there were many cases in which more than the regulation could be got. The officer retiring handed over the affair to a commission broker, and bidding was invited. A poor officer at the head of those of his own rank could not afford to pay the often very heavy price, and might see 3 or 4 of his juniors buy their way over his head, while he vainly waited for a vacancy by death, by which he would obtain his step without having to pay cash. The system of exchanges, which prevailed on the largest scale, also pressed very hardly on the impecunious. Officers from 199 other corps, where there was a block in promotion, managed for themselves a transference into battalions where there seemed to be a likelihood of a more rapid change of rank, by paying large differences for an exchange to those who stood at the head of the list. But there was also a good deal of exchanging for other reasons. Officers whose regiments were ordered to unhealthy or unpopular stations, such as the West Indies or New South Wales, offered considerable sums to others who were ready to accept the ineligible destination in return for hard cash. By careful management of this sort, a wealthy officer could procure himself very rapid promotion, e.g., a lieutenant might buy a captaincy in a West India regiment for a comparatively modest sum, and then, as a captain in such a corps, exchange on a second payment with a broken or needy captain in some other regiment on a European station, to whom money was all-important, and so get well established in his new rank, without ever really having quitted home or served in the corps into and out of which he had rapidly come and gone, on paper only. It is said that one young officer, who had the advantages of being wealthy, a peer, and possessed of great family influence in Parliament, was worked up from a lieutenancy to a lieutenant colonelcy in a single year. This, of course, was a very exceptional case, and happened long ere the Peninsular War began, but it may be remembered that Wellington himself was, through similar advantages on a smaller scale, enabled to move up from ensign on March 7, 1787, to lieutenant colonel in September 1793, 5 steps in 7 years, during which he had been moved through as many regiments, 2 of horse and 5 of foot. He was only 19 months a captain and 6 months a major, and he had seen no war service whatever when he sailed for Flanders in command of the 33rd at the age of 23. The Duke of York later insisted on a certain minimum service in each rank before promotion could be obtained. Contrast with such promotion that of the poor and 200 friendless officer, who, after 25 years of service, 6 peninsular campaigns, and 2 wounds, found himself still a captain at the age of 43. 198, but there were plenty of unlucky men who at the end of the war were still only lieutenants after 6 campaigns, and were placed on half-pay as such, at the great disbandment of the 2nd Battalions, which took place in 1816-17. The juxtaposition of rapid promotion obtainable by influence and the purchase of steps, with absolute stagnation in a low rank, which often fell on the impecunious officer, whose regiment did not chance to have many casualties in action, was appalling and monstrous. I take it that the most pernicious of all the disturbing causes which told against the right distribution of promotion was political influence. As a contemporary pamphleteer wrote, instances are very few indeed of preferment being obtained by other corrupt means. 199 compared to the omnipotence of parliamentary interest. Thence originates the shameful practice of thrusting boys into a company over the heads of all the lieutenants and ensigns of the regiment. The Duke of York has done something to check it, but he can never remove the colossus of parliamentary interest, an interest that disdains solicitation and imperiously demands from the minister of the day that which no minister ever found it convenient to deny. To this species of influence, the commander-in-chief must give way, for it is capable, when slighted, of removing both commander-in-chief and minister. 200. The king's hard bargains. It was to the unscrupulous use, by great men of their parliamentary influence, upon the ministry of the day, that the 2-1 army owed a great proportion of its king's hard bargains in the commissioned ranks. The obscure but necessary instruments of one of the great borough-mongers, Whig no less than Tory, were often paid by the nomination of their sons or other young relatives to a commission, by the influence of their patron, and the families that did the dirty work of a great politician were not likely to be distinguished for high morals or uprightness. Sometimes the nominations were absolutely shameful. It is said that the son of the keeper of a fashionable gaming house in St. James was slid into the list of ensigns on one occasion by a politician whom his father had obliged. Whether this be true or not, it is certain that there was a sprinkling of officers who were not gentlemen in any sense of the term serving throughout the war. 201 others, about whose gentle blood there was no doubt, were undesirable in other ways, prominent among them a section of young Irish squireens with the bullying and duelling habits, as well as the hard drinking, which were notoriously prevalent among the less civilized strata of society beyond St. George's Channel. I find in one memoir a note of a newly joined ensign after mess addressing the assembled officers as follows: "By Jassus, gentlemen, I am conscious you must have the meanest opinion of my courage. Here have I been no less than 6 weeks with the regiment, and the divil of a duel have I fought yet. Now, Captain C, you are the senior captain, and if you please, I will begin with you first, so name your time and place. As the diarist very wisely writes, one could not be too guarded in one's conduct with such heroes." 202. Duels, I may remark in passing, were much less frequent in the Peninsular Army than might have been expected. Wellington, though long after he most foolishly went out, with Lord Winchelsea in 1829, set his face against them on active service, because he could not afford to lose 202 good officers on account of personal quarrels. There certainly were much fewer duels proportionately in the Peninsula than in England at the time, not to speak of Ireland and India, where they were beyond all reason common. I have only found records of 4 fatal duels in the records of court-martials, and though non-fatal ones could have been, and were hushed up, they cannot have been very numerous, for one may read through scores of memoirs and diaries without running upon the mention of one. It is curious to note that when they did occur, and a court-martial followed, that body invariably found that though there was no doubt that Captain A or Lieutenant B was dead, yet there was no conclusive proof that he had been killed by C or D, the mouths of the seconds being sealed by the fact that they were also on their trial for having acted in such a capacity. 203. The whole matter was clearly a solemn farce. But the fact remains that duels were not frequent, and that duelists had a bad mark against them. Good commanding officers took immense trouble to prevent a duel from arising over silly mestable quarrels, exerting every influence to make one party, or both, apologize for words spoken in anger or in liquor. 204. The body of officers of a peninsular regiment was often a very odd party. There might be a lieutenant colonel of 26, who had risen rapidly by purchase or interest, and captains of 50 or even 60. I found a note of one who had attained that age in the 73rd. At the head of each rank, there might be several impecunious and disappointed men, waiting for the promotion that could only come by casualties in action, since they could never hope to purchase their step. Nevertheless, the feuds that might 203 have been expected to follow such a situation do not seem to have been so many or so bitter as might have been expected. The grudge was set against the system rather than the individual in most cases, and the sight of a mess cut up into cliques and coteries of enemies, though it can be found recorded occasionally, was quite exceptional. 205. The saving fact was that there was always the chance of promotion for merit, in reward of some specially gallant deed, and it often came, though the Duke was occasionally incomprehensible in the way in which he mentioned or did not mention officers in dispatches. The lieutenant who brought down the French flag from the castle of Badajoz and who was sent with it by Picton to the commander-in-chief was thanked and asked to dinner, but was still a lieutenant years after, in spite of his general's vehement remonstrances. 206 dozens of such instances could be quoted. Professional training. Professional training for officers had perforce been non-existent in the early years of the French War. There was no institution which supplied it, and all military knowledge had to be acquired by rule of thumb at regimental headquarters. An improvement of the greatest importance was made by the establishment in December 1801 of the Royal Military College at High Wycombe for the use of young officers, followed by the creation of its junior department in May 1802 for the instruction of those who from early life are intended for the military profession. The latter, the origin of the college at Sandhurst, to which the department was removed in 1811, accepted boys as early as 13. Its first inspector general was the French émigré Jarry, to whom we owe the Instructions 204 for light infantry in the field of 1804, while Colonel John Gaspard Le Marchant was lieutenant governor and superintendent general. This was the accomplished cavalry officer who fell in 1812 at the head of his brigade in the crisis of the Battle of Salamanca, when he had just delivered a decisive charge. The military college men were already numerous when the Peninsular War began. The Belemites. The French general Foy, a witness whose authority can hardly be called in question, for he is making grudging admissions, says that he considered the general mass of the British officers excellent. 207. The more we study detailed records, the more willingly do we acknowledge that his praise is well deserved. The weaker brethren were very few, so few that an enemy did not even notice them. Misconduct on the field was the rarest of offenses. There are hardly half a dozen court-martials for suspected slackness, among the hundreds that were held for other offenses. There were an appreciable number of officers broke for faults that came from hard drinking, incapable when on duty, and so forth, or brawling, and a very few for financial irregularities. But considering the unpromising material that was sometimes pitchforked into regiment by the unscrupulous exercise of patronage at home, they were exceedingly few. The only class of failures who had any appreciable numbers and earned a special name were the Belemites, so called from the general depart at the convent of Belém in the suburbs of Lisbon. This was the headquarters of all officers absent from the front as convalescents or on leave, and the limited proportion who stayed there overlong and showed an insufficient eagerness to return to their regiments were nicknamed from the spot where they lingered beyond the bounds of discretion. Wellington occasionally gave an order to Colonel Peacock, the military governor of Lisbon, to rout up this coterie. There were always a sprinkling there who were not over-anxious 205 to resume the hard life of campaigning, and loved too much the gambling hells and other sordid delights of Lisbon. 208. Occasionally, the notices which appear in general orders about these gentry are rather surprising. One would not have thought that such men could even have obtained a commission. Take, for example, the commanding officer at Lisbon, or the commanding officer of any station at which captain of the 88th may happen to be found, will be pleased to place that officer under arrest and send him to join his regiment, he having been absent for several months without leave, and having been in Portugal since October 20th last, without reporting himself to or communicating with his commanding officer. 209. Wellington, in his moments of irritation, sometimes wrote as if the majority of his officers were slack and disobedient. Such men existed, but as one who knew the Duke well observed, by long exercise of absolute power he had become intolerant of the slightest provocation, and every breach of discipline, no matter how limited its range, made him furious with the whole army. Hence frequent general orders, as violent as they were essentially unjust, wherein, because of the misdeeds of a few, all who served under him were denounced, the officers as ignorant of their duty, the rank and file as little better than a rabble, 210. But the duty-shirking officer, and still more the disreputable officer, was, after all, a very rare exception. The atmosphere of contempt which surrounded him in his regiment as a rule sufficed to make him send in his papers, after a longer or a shorter period of endurance, in proportion as his skin was tough or thin. Opinion was not so hard upon the man who was merely quarrelsome and 206 ungentlemanly in his cups, but there were limits even to the boisterousness permitted to the tippler, and drunkenness when in face of the enemy or in a position of military responsibility was always fatal. Officers from the ranks. There was, throughout the war, a perceptible proportion of officers who had risen from the ranks. Meritorious service, showing good capacity as well as courage, not unfrequently led to the promotion of a sergeant to an ensigncy. A well-remembered case is that of the Sergeant Newman of the 43rd, who rallied the stragglers during the march from Lugo to Betanzos in the Corunna retreat and beat off the pursuing French dragoons. Another is that of Sergeant Masterson of the 287th, who captured the Eagle of the 8th Line at Barossa. Many more might be quoted, though none of them is so striking as that of a man who did not serve in the Peninsula, but in contemporary campaigns in India, the celebrated John Shipp. He was twice given a commission for deeds of exceptional daring. After winning his first ensigncy in the storming party at the Siege of Bhurtpur in 1805, he was forced to sell out a little later by improvident living. He enlisted as a private in another regiment and was again promoted from the ranks for a single combat with a Nepalese chief during the First Gorkha War of 1815. Conducting himself with more wisdom on his second chance, he served long as an officer, and when he went on half-pay became Chief Constable of Liverpool. His autobiography is an artless and interesting piece of work well worth perusal. When a regiment had greatly distinguished itself in the field, Wellington not unfrequently directed its colonel to recommend a sergeant for a commission. This, for example, was done for all 3 battalions of the Light Division after their splendid exploit at Basako. Yet he did not approve of this system of promotion as anything but a very exceptional measure, and in his table talk with Lord Stanhope we find some very harshly worded verdicts on old rankers. Their origin would come out, and U-207 could never perfectly trust them, 211 especially in the matter of drink. This seems to be a typical instance of the Duke's aristocratic prejudices, but there was something in what he said. The position of the promoted sergeants was certainly difficult, and it required a man of exceptional character to make it good. As a rule, they drifted into the position of paymasters, recruiting officers, barrack masters, and such-like posts, but many of them made useful and efficient adjutants. In command, they were not as a rule successful, 212, and I have only come on a single case of one who reached the rank of full colonel, and of 2 who were fortunate enough to obtain a majority. It is clear that the purchase system pressed very hardly upon them. With no private resources, it was impossible for them ever to buy a step, and after reaching the rank of captain, they almost invariably went upon half-pay or looked for employment in some civil or semi-civil capacity. Concerning the equipment of the officer, his baggage, his horses and mules, and his servants, information will be found in another chapter. Here we are dealing with him as an item in the machinery of the regiment. Chapter 12. Internal organization of the regiment, the rank and file. He who would make himself acquainted in detail with the many experiments by which British governments, from the rupture of the Peace of Amiens onward, strove to keep on foot in full numbers the very large army that it had raised, must satisfy his curiosity by studying the admirable volumes of Mr. Fortescue. Here we are concerned only with the methods which prevailed Froti and gave Wellington the invincible, though often attenuated, battalions which conquered at Talavera and Basako, at Salamanca and Toulouse. Volunteers from the militia. In the Peninsular Army, the system of territorial names prevailed for nearly all the regiments of the line, but in most cases the local designation had no very close relation with the actual provenance of the men. There were a certain number of regiments that were practically national, e.g., most of the Highland battalions and nearly all of the Irish ones were very predominantly Highland and Irish as to their rank and file. But even in the 79th or the 88th, there was a certain sprinkling of English recruits. And in some nominally Scottish regiments, like the 71st Highland Light Infantry or the 90th Perthshire Volunteers, 213, the proportion of English and Irish was very large. Similarly, in almost all the nominally English regiments, there was a 209 large sprinkling of Irish and a few Scots. This came partly from the fact that, though the corps recruited in their own districts, yet they were often allowed to send recruiting parties to great centres like London, Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, or Dublin. But still more was it due to the fact that the larger half of the recruits were raised not in the old normal fashion, but by volunteering from the embodied militia, and that in this system practically no attempt was made to confine the choice of militiamen wishing to join the regular army to their territorial regiment. Nothing, for example, was more usual than to find such things as 100 of the King's County militia joining the 31st or Huntingdonshire Regiment. When the 77th or East Middlesex Regiment returned from India in 1808, it was completed before going out to the peninsula from the 1st West York, North and South Mayo, Northampton and South Lincoln militia, but did not get a single man from the Middlesex militia. 214, the Shropshire Regiment, 53rd, when allowed in a similar case to call for volunteers, did get 99 from its own county militia, but 144 more from the Dorset, East York, and Montgomery local corps. 215, the 81st or Loyal Lincoln was filled up in 1808 before sailing for Portugal from the Dublin, King's County, South Devon, and Montgomery militia. Instances might be multiplied ad nauseum. It was quite exceptional for any English corps to contain a preponderance of men from its own nominal district, and nearly all of them had from a fifth to a fourth of Irish.